So basically, Dunhuang, in a sense, is kind of like a symbol of these intercultural phenomena that are happening today.
Well, good morning. Thank you for coming, and it's lovely to have you here in Hong
Well,
Kong.
thank you for having me.
Yeah, at the ISF Academy, and I understand that you have been here multiple times, and actually even this year, you were here for other academic activities. Um, so, could you tell me a little bit about your academic journey, how you became a specialist in Dunhuang manuscripts and a world authority in Dunhuang?
Okay, well, I'm not a world authority on Dunhuang, but yeah, I basically got involved because I got a job at the British Library. So I did my PhD at Berkeley in California, and I was interested, or my dissertation was on the structure of Chinese writing in the pre-Qin period, so in early China. And then I got, basically there was a position advertised at the British Library, and I had several people contacting me saying, this is a position perfect for you because it involved doing computers, languages, and also Chinese manuscripts, which I was doing, but these manuscripts were from 1,000 years later. And so I applied for the job, and they were kind enough to hire me. And this is where I spent the next 10 years, or almost 10 years. And that was my first proper job. And the project was on Dunhuang manuscript. So I basically, initially, I tried to continue my own speciality and publish in that. But with time, because I spent most of my time giving talks at conferences on Dunhuang manuscripts, introducing the project. So eventually I started publishing in that field as well. And so gradually I kind of shifted into that direction.
Right. So prior to your work at the British Library, you didn't actually work on Dunhuang manuscript, or
No, not
what
at
was
all.
your understanding of Dunhuang before?
And no, I didn't work on Dunhuang manuscripts. I worked on the bamboo slip manuscripts and mostly bamboo slip manuscripts from early China, so it's like the 4th century BC. And I knew some things about the Dunhuang manuscripts, partly because, well, this was kind of part of the general knowledge in academia, in sinology, and at that time, so this would have been sort of the late 90s and early 2000s. One of the main topics, for example, was the forgery of Dunhuang manuscripts. So this goes back to Professor Fujieda's idea that, yes, that many of them were actually forged. And so I had that kind of background, kind of very passive knowledge. I was not very acquainted with them. But as I became part of this community and I went to conferences, to meetings, I gradually started, well, became interested, and I also started working with them.
I see. So it's incredible to think about it. You spent 10 years working on Dunhuang manuscripts alone, and that was your job there. Um, could you describe what the field was like when you first entered? Was it thriving? Like, did you have chance to talk with people who do the same thing, or you're sort of the rare people who have the chance to actually work on these materials?
Well, it was basically I was an outsider coming into this, so for me, it was quite interesting that I didn't have stakes in the game. So when I went to a conference, they would have been, in China, for example, there would be 300 scholars, famous authorities in the field, and so I could have been very nervous about this, but I wasn't because it was not my field. It was I was I was an outsider. I was doing a job basically. So, and that worked out really well for me because I got into this field without actually deserving that in a sense. And then there were many older or younger even scholars in China who were extremely kind to me. And so they kept, well, sharing information with me and also inviting me to more things, events. And so basically it's through these people that I became acquainted with Dunhuang studies.
So you went in the field without expectation or burden of any kind, and by the time of the end of your 10 years in a British library, how did you see yourself? Like, did you see yourself continuing in this field for the rest of your career at that point? And how did you move on to Cambridge?
Oh, I see. Well, first of all, in the British Library, my job wasn't really to study so it was not a research position. It was it was a project manager. I was position. I was responsible for the overseas, so non-British, overseeing the non-British activities of the project. And so that involved research, of course, but it involved a lot of other things. And amongst others, I had to meet people quite often. So that was also very interesting, because then I could learn by just talking to people, going to dinners and attending all sorts of meetings, participating in sort of the sessions for digitizing manuscripts and these. So kind of looking at this from behind the scenes. And then when I moved on to Cambridge, it wasn't really, there wasn't a break in my research direction. So at that point, I was already kind of working my way into this field, being interested in Dunhuang studies, and seeing my scholarly output as part of Dunhuang studies. So when I went to Cambridge, I continued with that. And I, for example, initially, I was going to take students, graduate students, who were also working on something similar. This is not how it kind of ended up, because some of them changed their topics after they came, because they pitched a Dunhuang studies project and then kind of pivoted once they were accepted. Not kind of
Was it intentional?
no, not necessarily intentionally, or with a kind of a hit. They didn't come with a hidden agenda. Just, I guess they became more interested in something else.
I see. Well, it's normal to pick a topic that is somewhat connected to your supervisor's main interest. But it does happen very often that in the process of research that students will find something that truly drawn them in.
Yeah, that's something that resonates with them much closer. Yeah.
Right. How about for yourself? In the course of your research, did you feel that there's particular area that you feel that sort of took you to a direction that you did not anticipate, or you feel that is very much you know where you're going with your current research?
No, I don't know where I'm going, and I never knew where I was going. But basically, I was interested initially because I studied the structure of writing. So I was kind of interested in the writing system.
Right.
So in Dunhuang manuscripts, I also became interested in that, and so I tried to work with kind of the character forms used in Dunhuang manuscripts, like, the forms introduced by Empress Wu Zetian, or all these kind of so-called 数字, or popular or vulgar forms. This is what I was interested in, but somehow this didn't really lead to anything important, I think. And some of this research has never been published. I mean, my own research. I was never satisfied enough with it to complete it. And in the meantime, I started working kind of on, my main interest kind of became this multilingualism, which was not a dimension present in the early Chinese manuscripts, but it was in the case of Dunhuang and Turfan and Karakoto. And the other thing is the physical properties, or the the physical traits of manuscripts, so the physicality of the manuscripts, and kind of these two things together that became my main focus. And I think if I'm thinking now about my next book, I'm thinking of doing one of these things, or maybe two of them combined. And my last book was also related to this.
Right, because when those who are familiar with your work understand that you spend quite a bit of time looking at the book forms and the transmission and also the writing technology, the book making technology and so on. And I want to talk about the first topic that you just mentioned, the multilingual dimension. How does that play in your research?
Well, I'm just basically, I feel that, for example, in Dunhuang specifically, we have this enormous body of manuscripts, which is multilingual, and the traditional way of looking at it is really disciplinary in a sense that everybody looks at it from their own discipline, and people in Chinese studies look at Chinese manuscripts, and people in Tibetan studies look at Tibetan manuscripts. And I think that's just fundamentally, I'm not saying it's wrong, it's not enough. So you need to look at it as a whole. And of course, there were some famous Japanese scholars in the past, like Ikeda-on and to some extent Professor Fujieda later, who were advocating that way of looking at these manuscripts. And I feel that this is one of those areas where I guess I can contribute, or I can go into, not because I'm that good at this, but because other people are doing less of it than, for example, working on literature or some specific Buddhist texts. So in those cases or in those subfields, I guess my contribution wouldn't be as important, or I wouldn't be able to, because they're much more developed and much more well researched, and people are just better at it than I am. So I'm interested in this multilingual dimension, and also the book forms, which also has maybe it's not a linguistic dimension, but it's a transcultural dimension. And again, I think that in Central Asia, at a time when Dunhuang was not part of China proper, we have to look at Central Asian book cultures to understand what's happening in Dunhuang. And if we don't, if we just think in terms of Dunhuang as an internal body of culture and text, then we're missing something. And in fact, this is the case. Then there are some processes that then we cannot understand because we zoom in too closely, and we choose to disregard quite a bit of other stuff around us.
Yes, I recall some of your works that you touch on the translingual issues, and I understand that you work with Tangut and Mongolian and Tibetan, and of course the Chinese in different forms. Could you give us some examples of how you put all this together?
Okay, so I'm not directly working with most of these languages because I don't read like Mongolian or Tibetan. I've studied Tangut, and I have written on Tangut texts, but my interest is not linguistic in terms of Tangut. I'm still interested in this idea of texts and sometimes manuscripts moving between cultures. But nevertheless, I'm very open or interested in the languages that are happening, that are seen around Dunhuang and in Dunhuang. So Tibetan obviously is a major influence there. You mentioned Mongolian. Mongolian is not represented within the Dunhuang Library Cave, but I recently worked on a printed Mongolian text, which was actually was found in Karakoto, which is actually a translation of a Chinese Taoist story. And even not being able to speak Mongolian, I was able to identify the background story, and I found this fascinating, very interesting. How so to do this kind of research between languages, and of course, I'd love to learn Mongolian. It's just like I haven't, and I'm yeah.
It's very surprising. I mean, the more languages you know, of course, the more you would discover from the sources. Can you say a few words about the general, your understanding of Dunhuang study in its current state, and how you feel like as aspiring young scholars who are interested in, even students in Dunhuang, what do you think that what should they do?
Okay, I think the current state of Dunhuang studies is quite interesting. In China, it's really very well developed. I don't know if the word booming is good, because it has been booming already for the past 20 years. And there were these mega conferences, multiple conferences a year, or dozens probably a year. So it is very well developed, and there are lots of people, lots of scholars in it. In the West, it's a little bit different. So in the West, I think people there are fewer people who work specifically on Dunhuang studies, but then the people who work, say, in Buddhist studies, and then they study some text from Dunhuang, or they're interested in specific aspects of Buddhist manuscripts in Dunhuang, or historical figures in Dunhuang, like that. Or other people work on Tibetan studies, and then they primarily focus on the Dunhuang material. So I see in the West, for example, in the West, we do not have a Dunhuang Studies journal, right? So there are all sorts of journals there about Buddhist studies. There's like a dozen journals, but not one on Dunhuang studies.
Is it one that you plan to start?
No. I don't plan that, and I don't think maybe that the Western or non-Chinese academia could support that. And actually, it's not just a Chinese phenomenon, but because in Kyoto at the Jinbunken, there was Takata Tokyo also had this journal, the Nempo, right, the Nianbao, so which was an annual. I think it came out once a year or twice a year, once a year, but it's for some reason it's being discontinued now. So we're left with the Chinese journals on Dunhuang studies. So I think the Western coverage of Dunhuang studies is quite different. It's more coming from different angles and using the material. So in China, we have a special case where you focus on this group of material and you make it into studies, right? Which is not really a studies, because technically it shouldn't be, like, in terms of methodology and in terms of disciplinary approach, it shouldn't be any different from another body of text, say Turfan. But in China, you also have Turfan studies, you have Dunhuang studies. Right. So that's kind of an interesting way of forming a studies, but which doesn't happen in the West, or didn't happen in the West.
Yeah, so you did mention that the overall academic environment to support Dunhuang study would be quite different in the West as compared to China, and Japan seems to be changing, but they did have a tradition of very outstanding
Absolutely, yeah.
As well.
And in the West, it's the name Dunhuang is much less known, of course, than in China. So in China, it's a big brand name, Dunhuang, right? Yes. Everybody knows what it is, and of course, they mostly associate it with something you might call like superficial things, like the flying apsaras and these kind of things, which are well represented in the popular media. But in the West, if you say, like, if people ask me what do I work on, and I say the Dunhuang manuscripts, they might say, oh, like Dunhuang manuscripts. Yes. Like, oh, that's what you're interested in. Wow.
In Spanish, yes.
Yeah. So.
Well, in that case, of course, the question for a lot of people who are passionate about Dunhuang study would be how to promote Dunhuang in the West. But before that, People may want to ask you, what's the relevance of Dunhuang in scholarship in general, Western scholarship, or scholarship in general, or even in the society? How would you say that? I know this is a question that scholars hate when they have to
Justify
to justify
their
what they're
research.
doing.
Yeah. No, but actually, in the case of Dunhuang studies, it's quite interesting because Dunhuang studies goes back, let's say, already over 100 years, right? And it has been extremely influential in the West. So Western sinology kind of grew up on this and on this material. So of course it's partly because of the work of people like Paul Paleo, yes, who've kind of processed much of this material and then kind of spat it out or kind of poured it out back into the field with erudite comments. And so this is kind of course, there's a 19th century tradition, especially French tradition, even 18th century of sinology, but somehow this early part of the 20th century was very, very influential. And I didn't realize this before I started working on Dunhuang, and I haven't looked at the writings of Paleo and some other people early on, how much of what I studied as a sinologist when I was in school was actually stemming from that, coming from that tradition. So, and I think many sinologists, younger sinologists, may not recognize that because they don't specifically work on Dunhuang manuscripts. But if you work on, say, medieval China, a lot of the material you look at, a lot of the methodology actually is coming from studying these manuscripts early on. So up until during the pre-war period, for example. And thinking about Dunhuang today, I think it's also still very relevant because of this, the city being at the intersection of so many cultures. The result was something quite significant, quite spectacular, that you had a culture which produced not only the manuscripts, but a lot of art that merges together elements from all of these civilizations very successfully. So Dunhuang, in a sense, is kind of like a symbol of these intercultural phenomena that are happening today.
So you're here with us for a few days at the ISF Academy. You see some of our students. They have from the primary, they have some games and stories related to Dunhuang. To more advanced students, they have lectures on these Dunhuang materials, and some of them have been to Dunhuang for the experiential learning program. How do you feel? What more could be done to introduce Dunhuang to both the public and the students, and even to more advanced students?
It's actually really good to see this Dunhuang exhibition that's happening here at the ISF and sort of how Dunhuang is integrated into the curriculum of young students, because it's an example what can be done. So I think they have all these games and the lecture series, they have the exhibition, they have all sorts of prizes. All of these things are quite successful in using Dunhuang to promote something. And I think the important thing here is not that we want to make them familiar with Dunhuang per se, but rather Dunhuang is a wonderful example for them to engage in some sort of, well, first of all, they're engaging in the study of their heritage, of their past. But and at the other hand, it's an example of kind of this human collaboration and exchange, intercultural exchange, has been happening in the past as well. So they see this. And yeah, Hong Kong is a wonderful place for this because it's so multicultural. I think we should marvel at this, how suitable Dunhuang is for passing on this message.
I see. Well, I think that's a wonderful message as a closing to this short interview. Thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me. And so for being able to be part of this whole exhibition.
Thank you.
Thank you.